Welcome to this Wise Words academic seminar hosted by the Contemplative Studies Center at the University of Melbourne. I'm Nicholas Van Dam, the director of the center. I'd like to begin by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which many of us here in Melbourne reside. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners on other lands from which those of you out there may be joining us. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and to any First Nations peoples joining us here today. Today, we are joined by Associate Professor Jaime Kucinskas, Chair of the Department of Sociology at Hamilton College in New York. Jaime's research examines the multi-institutional context in which people experience spiritual states and meaningfulness, as well as the constitutive institutional conditions under which people engage in moral sense-making. In today's presentation, Jaime will discuss what social scientists know about social effects of spiritual practice and the conditions under which contemplative practice can foster more pro-social, civic, and political engagement. If you have questions, please post them in the Q&A at any stage, and Jaime will address as many of them as possible towards the end of the session. Thank you for joining us, and welcome, Jaime.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. So I'm just going to pop my slides on. So I received Nicholas's invitation. I was really excited to be invited to this series in particular. The title of your colloquium is in itself an invitation to bring together wisdom and a deep dive into contemplative science. And mulling over my talk for today, I noticed how just by couching the colloquium under the umbrella of wisdom and science, how different it felt for me than preparing a typical academic or conference talk, which is where I spent most of my academic time. So this one was fun for me. So thank you so much, Nicholas, again, for inviting me. An invitation to bring these two things together is what draws a lot of us to this field. I think it's the secret sauce that makes this work so meaningful and important. We all have deep questions. And speaking for myself, my academic research has been one way to answer some deeper and possibly unanswerable questions, like what does it mean to be a good human being? How do we live a good life? How do we affect other people? And what blinders and blind spots do we have in how we live? And I want to preface my talk by acknowledging that as an academic who meditates, I see myself very much in the research that I am going to discuss today. So let me just click through. So how did I get involved in contemplative research? So I was drawn to studying what has come to be called mindfulness because of my own deep questions and wounds like so many others. My dad died of a heart attack when he was 54, and I went to the Tibetan Buddhist in Bloomington, Indiana, where I was going to graduate school to find answers. And what I found to my surprise was a lot of middle-aged white meditators who were talking about neuroscience. I also saw a lot of different teachers coming through the center who are talking about these scientific collaborations between Buddhists and between neuroscientists and psychologists. As a sociologist who wasn't used to normal people talking about our academic research, I was really surprised. I was also surprised because my Chinese grandmother was a Buddhist, and her version of Buddhism had seemed so foreign to me growing up as a third-generation Chinese American in suburban Connecticut. So I decided to follow the thread and figure out where is this neuroscience coming from, and how are these lay white meditators in rural Indiana finding out about this research. A spry and encouraging Buddhist nun and abbess Thubten Chodron encouraged me to follow that thread and helped me out and helped me get the project started by emailing early on another meditator who she'd met in the mountains in Nepal in 1970s when she was a hippie going by the name of Wild Cherry. And that man turned out to be Adam Engel, who was one of the co-founders of the Mind and Life Institute, an organization at the center of bringing Buddhism and scientists together. So the questions that I focused my book project on in my dissertation at the time was, how has Buddhist-inspired meditation become so popular in mainstream America? Who is spreading it and legitimizing Buddhist-inspired contemplative practices, and how are they doing so? I was also drawn to study the spread of contemplative practice in the workplace because academia to me at the time seemed like such a competitive pressure cooker, which was seemingly pretty devoid of spirit. And here were these amazing scholars who seemed to do it all. They combined spiritual practice, deep values committed to society, and they brought their work to the public in service of improving society and making people's lives better. They were humanizing the workplace, breaking a path, enabling people to bring their whole selves to work, and making society better. And as I collected and analyzed my data as a sociologist, I began to wonder more and more, are there trade-offs that contemplative leaders are making as they popularize meditation in secular spaces? So at the time I started studying what came to be known as the mindfulness movement, people were still calling Buddhist-inspired meditation practices a lot of different terms. Adam Engel, the founder of the Mind and Life Institute, told me that they didn't know what to call it at first. Contemplative practice and meditation seemed to be the most commonly used terms among the Buddhist-inclined academics that I first encountered. I like the terms contemplative and spiritual practice more these days because they seem to acknowledge the variety of practices, meanings, and purposes under their conceptual purview. But so anyway, so I hopped in what I realized was quickly becoming a mindfulness circuit at the time. I started meeting with and interviewing scholar practitioners at the Mind and Life Institute and at academic centers around the United States. So this is like 2008, 2009, I started planning the project, and I interviewed from 2009 until 2015. As I met people, they told me about other leaders who were bringing contemplative practice into new institutional spaces, like in business, the military, like all sorts of different places in higher education. And so I went and I visited all of these different mindfulness-based intervention programs around the country. I visited their events, their conferences, some retreats. I also read what they wrote. I analyzed their websites and their media coverage. So I came at it from a bunch of different directions. And what I realized as I was studying this group of people is that all of these different groups of people who are bringing mindfulness into science, into business, into education, they were coalescing at the same time in real time as I was studying them. So as I connected with them, it was a really exhilarating feeling of all of these people who are really excited about their work and their practices coming together and finding each other. I met all sorts of interesting people. There were entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley who are trying to make it big on a mindfulness app. Tim Ryan, a congressman from Ohio, was on his circuit, as were a number of journalists and philanthropists and venture capitalists and all sorts of people. So as I interviewed people, I asked contemplative leaders about their personal, spiritual, and professional histories, their organizational work histories, and about their mindfulness-based intervention programs. And asked them how they were bringing in these practices into all of these different secular spaces. And what I found was I found a number of puzzles. There's a lot of paradoxes inherent in mindfulness and meditation, as Elegant Sauerborn, a German scholar, also discusses in a recent paper. But the initial question I had as I started talking to people, especially coming at this project as a sociologist who was grounded more in the social movement literature, the question was like, how has it been so seemingly easy to make meditation so popular among professionals who everyone says wouldn't be open to these kinds of practices? And so central to the answer that I came up with in my book, In the Mindful Elite, was that the proponents of Buddhist-inspired contemplative practices have a lot of privileges compared to the average American. They were highly educated and had a lot of social status. So nearly half the people I interviewed had a PhD or other terminal degree, like a JD or a medical degree. Many people were professors or leaders of their organization. Others were founders of their contemplative programs. So these are people who were leaders. They also had very sophisticated and well-heeled social networks, which also helped them. And in addition, talking to the people whom I spoke with tended on average to be more likely to be male and more likely to be white than any other racial or ethnic background. So what I realized was the spread of mindfulness wasn't like a social movement. It was operating more like a consensus-based movement through privileged elites. So because a lot of the people I spoke with were established academics, or other business leaders already, they didn't have to knock on the door from the outside. They already were members of these organizations. They wanted to bring contemplative practices in, so they could just, walk through the door and connect with people they already knew and work those networks to get resources and access to bringing these programs into prestigious workplaces. So given the time constraints today, I won't talk about all of the things I have listed here as elements of this consensus-based mobilization process, but I'll talk about some of the things and pull out some of the things that pertain to the talk today about like what are these practices and what are their larger impacts on society. And so I'll start by talking about how contemplative leaders adapted Buddhist meditation to appeal to other professionals, and how they fit it to the organizations they were bringing it into. And then I'll talk a little bit about the strengths and shortcomings of this approach, and some of the implications down the road on what the greater impacts of meditation mindfulness are on organizations, organizational change, social justice, and the communities outside of practice groups. And I think it's important to recognize first that the founders of these influential mindfulness organizations had really good intentions, and they hope to generate positive impacts on both individuals and larger society. So here I'm going to have to move my Zoom screen a little bit to read this. But so, for example, MBS founder John Kabat-Zinn wrote in 2014, "The awareness we are speaking of when we're using the term mindfulness also encompasses the motivations for our actions. For example, the ways we are driven by self-aggrandizement or greed. In the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009, we've seen the effects of greed played out on a massive scale in banks and insurance companies. We need to create a different kind of confidence and a new kind of economics, one that's not about mindless spending, but is more about marshaling resources for the greater good, for one's own being, for society and the planet. Mindfulness can help open the door to that by helping us go beyond approaches that are based on conceptual thought alone and are driven by unbounded and legally sanctioned greed." And then also I have this other quote from Mind and Life Institute founder Adam Engel, and he described the work they were doing through the following explanation. So a way to look at this is that a lot of the problems that we face today, both individually and societally, come from the mind. And the truth of the matter is that it's going to be impossible to really develop the outer change that we're really interested in unless we also address the inner attitudes that had created that space in society. You can't change it, you name it, sexism, racism, unless you start with the underlying attitudes that create that. So in a broad sociological view, what we are about is to change the cultures of the world attitudinally and use contemplative-based training methods to do that. We're trying to change the world by providing interventions that people can use. So to get these practices in the door in secular organizations, they adapted meditation and mindfulness in a lot of different ways. Well, founder of the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, Mirabai Bush, told me that across all these interventions, the practices were virtually the same. Using my sociological research methods of interviewing and analysis, I began to see differences. So as people were moving Buddhist-inspired meditation across secular professional fields, they were adapting and changing it, and it was being described through different frames, purposes, and likely had different effects across these different places. And so I'll share with you a few examples of this from the Mindful Leap. So veteran Michael Taylor, for example, designed a program for military and law enforcement. And he told me, so we teach him breathing techniques in terms of kind of regulating the nervous system. Naropa University is very much Kagyu, and our team comes very much from that tradition. And so we start out with the nervous system regulation pieces, and then we transition into teaching them shamatha and vipassana. The shamatha, we call it riding the breath. And then the vipassana, we call it the zone. But all of our techniques are pulled from the pantheon of Tibetan Buddhist practice techniques, all of it. He told me, I put together a curriculum that was aimed at taking this into the world in a very particular languaging way. And so it was, okay, can I use that type of languaging to really communicate my training to this particular demographic? And the demographic is blue collar, get her done kind of guys. And so I designed a curriculum that comes from a very operational perspective. It's very mission oriented in terms of my experiences in combat. not talking about meditation, not doing anything they would consider weird or unusual. Don't ever use the word meditation. Don't even use the word mindfulness. It's all couched in science in terms of the neuroscience and the nervous system regulation. And again, it's all under the rubric of peak performance to some degree in terms of what we present to them. And others I spoke with in military mindfulness programs underscored how their programs promoted mental resilience to those in combat. So after teaching the program's basic contemplative techniques, participants in Taylor's program were taught to use techniques in close combat situations that involved multiple assailants and guns. There was the whole shooting match, he told me. Taylor admitted that his program was somewhat off the reservation in terms of normal meditation instruction. We don't really necessarily call it normal. It's not normal, he said, laughing. Their combat situations, he said, chuckling, would give ordinary meditation teachers and a lot of therapists a conniption fit. So this is an example of how some mindfulness programs can adapt a lot of facets of mindfulness. They can change what it's called, how it's taught, its purpose, in some pretty dramatic ways. So the second program I'm going to share with you is probably familiar to some of you. The Google Search Inside Yourself program has got a lot of media attention over the years. And as one of their founders, Mirabai Bush, told me, they first pitched their program as a stress reduction aid. But it wasn't cool to be stressed at Google, so they wouldn't sign up. When no one signed up, Googler Chad Ming-Tan reached out to Bush and they tried to make the program more appealing by pitching it as imparting tools to develop emotional intelligence. If we could frame it as emotional intelligence, then they'd recognize that they need that because it's kind of well known that techies aren't good at communicating. And this approach was more successful and the program failed. So in a second interview with Bush at the end of my study, I asked if they had adapted the program further over the years. And she said to make it appeal and more convenient for Googlers, they'd increase content on science as they developed it. And they now offered a shorter introductory class, which required less commitment from the overextended and busy Googlers. This was pretty different from Bush's first forays into meditation with Goenka in the early 70s. Goenka had told them, you should never teach meditation in less than 10 days all day and evening. Bush reflected that, of course, that doesn't work in this country for most people, but I really appreciated what he meant because in that amount of time, you can at least get a glimpse of what's possible. Without that, usually you don't. So the Google program was also different from when she first brought meditation into business at the seed company Monsanto 10 years earlier. Then she had Monsanto execs attend a multi-day Vipassana retreat. So as many programs bring mindfulness into new areas, the time spent in teaching can get dramatically cut down to fit the structures and the cultures of the organizations that they're moving into. And so, for example, in education, I saw some of the mindfulness teachers were teaching 15-minute lessons in schools where there's little time to be had. Oh no, my light went out. Let me turn it on. Okay, there it goes. So all of this raises some questions. Are these programs getting adapted? As these programs are getting adapted and differentiated, do their impacts change? And what is their impact off the cushion on the larger organizations that they're a part of? Has the Google Search Inside Yourself program really impacted the company in a fundamental way to alter the way it operates to be more humane for its workers? So I wondered all of these things as a sociologist. The other thing that was striking to me is that meditators were convinced they were changing the world in a manner similar to American evangelicals. By transforming one person at a time on the cushion or a class of them at a time, they thought their effects to produce more kind, compassionate, reflective people would reverberate out. And so as a sociologist, I wonder, how can we examine whether these things are happening or not? So based on my research for the Mindful Lead, I have not found evidence that the larger organizations people are a part of have been impacted by these meditation programs. Granted, Google would not share their data with me on the Search Inside Yourself program, so I can't be 100% sure. But of all the organizations I studied, when I asked mindful leaders for evidence of mindful programs' broader organizational impacts, I got very little evidence suggesting that it was occurring. So what I saw for the most part was that meditation rooms and programs seem physically separate from workplaces. It seemed like at a lot of these places, a small percentage of the organizational members were actually participating in the programs regularly. They were often the C-suite or like the knowledge workers, people known to be more skilled workers in the organization. So I didn't hear of like janitors or other people taking these classes. Carolyn Chen has a new book out on Buddhist inspired practices in Silicon Valley, and she has similar findings. So this raises the question, do these mindfulness-based intervention programs have a limited impact on organizational structures and broader organizational cultures? And so these are things that I hope that people will continue to look at. I did find a few positive examples of organizational change, but it seemed like they were the exception, not the norm. So I didn't see companies, for example, like raising the wages of people or cutting back work hours or like trying to think through what are the root causes of the stress and the burnout that people were citing and coming to practice meditation. But so one of the main examples that I found where it did seem like the contemplative practices were having a larger effect was a school in Maryland. And so there were a group of brothers who came in and created an after-school yoga program. And the program was so successful that then the school started allowing students to meditate while they were in detention. So that was, a really impressive outlier where you could see that the program was so successful that it was helping the organization reimagine how to better support, the students. But the dearth of information and evidence for organizational impacts raises a lot of questions about the purpose and deeper impacts of mindfulness programs, which researchers are now starting to answer. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I also want to just mention some unintended consequences and blind spots of the contemplative movement. And so this is another case from the book. And these pictures show some protesters from eviction-free San Francisco who burst on the stage during Google's talk on corporate mindfulness at the Wisdom 2.0 conference in 2014. They wanted to bring attention to the housing crisis lower and middle class San Francisco residents were facing due to the rapid growth of the tech industry in the area. So shouting on a bullhorn, one protester chanted, "Wisdom means to stop displacement. Wisdom means to stop surveillance. San Francisco's not for sale." Protester Amanda Ream explained in an article in the Buddhist magazine Tricycle, the tech industry's great economic boom is driving a housing crisis, with no-fault evictions increasing 175% since last year. Just like the gentrification of a neighborhood where new wealthy people displace people who've lived there longer, the Dharma is undergoing a process of gentrification in San Francisco today. Loss is the bigger picture of the teachings that asks us to consider interdependence and to move beyond self-help in addressing only our own suffering. The Dharma directs us to feel the suffering of others. When I zipped up that banner in a bag to sneak it into the conference, I thought about the ways this action could contribute to a larger conversation among people of conscience about how to stop the housing crisis in San Francisco. But the activists and the message of eviction-free San Francisco were disappeared without a word, censored from the live stream of the event. As we were marched out of the hall by angry conference staff, the Google presentation carried on, asking the audience to check in with their body about the conflict. No one addressed the issues we were raising, not then or later in the conference. It was a case study in spiritual bypassing. It's almost too easy to point this out at Wisdom 2.0. Most of the workshops offer lifestyle and consumer choices that are meant to help people heal from the harm, emptiness, and unsustainability associated with living under capitalism, but it does so without offering an analysis of where this disconnection comes from. The conference presents an evolution in consciousness of the wealthiest among us as the antidote to suffering rather than the redistribution of wealth and power. So in this explanation, Ream is bringing attention to the underbelly of spreading meditation through elites. So structural inequalities and other social problems that are obvious to outsiders fail to be addressed sometimes within elite circles. This is not surprising given that the people struggling to pay for rent or other basic needs will likely not be able to attend meditation retreats or other elite gatherings, which often happen in choice locations and require hotel fees, conference fees, and a number of other things. So instead, the elites spend their time introspecting and they seek to develop their own well-being and interpersonal relationships. but they can fail to engage in larger conversations with people not like them who have real problems and are experiencing a lot of inequality in the United States. So ultimately, despite Ream's dramatic outburst at Wisdom 2.0, it seemed like her protest failed to have an impact on the affluent contemplative attendees. And in the face of the contentious spike in inequality and the subsequent housing crisis that she raised, which has actually gotten worse since the time of her protest, meditators have turned their attention to themselves. And so this episode raises a lot of more questions about whether mindfulness is being facilitated through a gated community of mindfulness practitioners. Are meditators connected enough with their communities off the cushion? Are they actually helping others, or are they mainly focusing on themselves? So doing that book, The Mindful Lead, it made me acutely aware of how situationally dependent spiritual practices and experiences are, as well as the blind spots that practitioners can have based on the privileges and their positions in prestigious and well-resourced organizations. These insights led to my co-edited volume with Anna Soon and Brian Steensland, Situating Spirituality, which makes the case that spiritual people and scholars of spirituality alike need to pay more attention to how power, organizational cultures, hierarchical structures, and access to resources affect spirituality. Recent work, both mine and others, has helped me continue to try to answer the question of whether Buddhist-inspired meditation contributes to the greater good of society beyond individual mental health and well-being or not. So Carolyn Chen's new book, I highly recommend it. It just came out this year, and it takes this work one step further by looking at Buddhist-inspired practices in Silicon Valley during the period after I stopped my research. So she hones in on these elite professional techtopias, is what she calls them. And she finds, like similar to some of my findings, that mindfulness is being used in Silicon Valley's tech sector to make employees more productive. The ends of mindfulness have changed to improve individuals' work and to serve their organization's bottom lines. And while this can be a good thing in some ways, in that mindfulness is making work really meaningful and fulfilling for the tech workers at these companies, Chen identifies, I guess, a shadow side or an unintended consequence of, making work so appealing that workers want to spend all of their time there and they don't have any other social needs beyond work. It seems from her narrative that these tech workers have been captured. And they're not like going out to restaurants or spending much time in their community. And as a result, public resources and civic life is withering in Silicon Valley. So this kind of points to, how much of a risk is this elsewhere? How generalizable is this? Is this an extreme case, or is it a harbinger or a canary in a coal mine for other contemplative practitioners in other knowledge fields? Can Buddhist-inspired meditation practice, to the contrary, have a social justice and a community impact? So in answering that question, I do want to leave you with some hopeful things that give me hope. One, there is a number of contemplative programs that are bringing in race conscious and racial justice based perspectives into mindfulness trainings and programs. So Rhonda McGee's is in my book. I think she's an example of someone who does this very well. There's also burgeoning scholarship from social scientists on how activists are using forms of Buddhist inspired practices, different kinds of mindfulness to prepare for protests, engage in protests, and recover from protests that are fighting for more environmental sustainability, for addressing inequality, and a number of other public problems. In a recent paper with Evan Stewart, we pivot the question a little bit, and we ask, is spirituality this selfish thing, or is it a substitute for religion among disaffected people in the United States? And so to answer that question, we use data from the 2020 National Religion and Spirituality Survey, which has got some fun new measures. And in that study, which is recently out at the American Sociological Review, we asked, Do people distinguish reports of spiritual and religious practices? Who reports spiritual practice? Who reports religious practices? And then is spiritual practice similarly associated with political engagement as religious practice? And so I'll give you a quick overview of some of my findings. So to start, we had this measure which asked people from these batteries of activities, which of these do you do frequently as spiritual and which of these do you do frequently as religious? And then we ran principal components analysis to assess factors and clusters of these different activities among spiritual and religious practitioners. And we created scales, and then we found that among the practitioner, or among the people in this survey, 34% were not doing religious or spiritual practices, 18% were doing spiritual but not religious practices, and 19% were doing religious but not spiritual practices. And then lastly, 29% were doing spiritual and religious practices. And then for a dependent variable, we looked at political engagement. And so we had two main measures of this. One was we had a measure on self-reported voting, which was a 5-point scale asking how frequently they voted. And then we had a battery of other count items, asking them if they've done any of the following activities in the past 12 months. So had they attended a meeting to talk about political or social concerns? Had they been engaged in calling, writing, or visiting a government official to express their views on an issue? Had they given money to a candidate, a campaign, or an organization concerned with a political or social issue? Had they protested or signed a petition on the internet or on paper about a political or social issue? And so we did two sets of analyses around these different questions. And what we found, you can see here our results. So what we found, and this was actually to our surprise, because there's been so much criticism of how selfish or kind of therapeutic and individualistic spirituality is, especially, there's been this wave of critiques around mindfulness and neoliberalism and how spirituality is a form of neoliberalism, which suggests that it's like having people focus inward on their individual lives and that it's not like helping them connect back and help greater society. But by contrast, what we found was that the spiritual practitioners in our survey were as likely as religious practitioners to engage in, to vote, and also to engage in these different political activities. And so you can see up top in the top right corner, looking at using OLS estimates on self-reported voting, you can see spiritual and religious practitioners are about as likely as each other and more likely than non-practitioners to vote. And then you can see in the bottom part of this table that, so you can see like the zero inflation logit model shows that religious and spiritual people were less likely to not do, so this is the opposite. So they're less likely to do zero political activities. And then when we did a count model for activities greater than zero, we found that spiritual and religious practitioners were more likely to do more activities than non-practitioners. So just to summarize, American spiritual practitioners are more likely than non-practitioners to be politically and civically engaged. And they're about as likely as religious practitioners to be politically engaged. And so this, basically coming from the mindful Lee and shifting to look at political participation was like a pivot. And I realized that while contemplative practices might not be changing the larger organizations in which, they're occurring, spiritual people are still engaged in public life in their own time. So I covered a lot of ground. So to summarize, there's been a lot of successes with the contemplative movement and the spread of Buddhist-inspired meditation. There's been tremendous growth in the popularity of meditation in terms of individual practice and use and legitimacy in esteemed organizations like Google and Aetna and Yale and Harvard and Stanford and a lot of other sports. There's also a lot of testimonials of positive individual impacts of contemplative practices, and I heard that in my interviews as well. As I mentioned, there's burgeoning research on how Buddhist-inspired practices are also being used in activist groups. in helping them work on collective issues and bring attention to them and trying to solve the wicked problems we're facing as a global society. And as Evan and I's paper points to, American spiritual practitioners are also engaged in political behavior. So they are civically engaged. So it's not that with the decline of religion in the United States that people are no longer engaging in the public sphere. Spiritual people are on the rise and they are also engaged in the public sphere, albeit in different and new and innovative ways. I also want to just have some notes of caution to scholars and practitioners, so things to be aware of. There's tremendous differentiation in contemplative practices as they're moved across institutions. And that, I think, makes it important to recognize that contemplative practices are not all the same thing everywhere, and they likely have different impacts in different places. As Carolyn Chen's book and parts of the Mindful Elite point to, there's questionable impacts of some meditation practices in tech companies and other corporate settings. It's also questionable whether meditation contributes to more positive organizational impacts on workers, getting at the root problems and causes of stress that they face, like overwork. There's also a need to diversify contemplative practice groups within workplaces and also outside of them. There's a lot of homogeneity where people tend to practice with others like themselves. Nalika Gajawira's work, she's an anthropologist in California, and she points to the need for more awareness around that issue. And there's room for improvement in developing communities of practice where practitioners can foster more pro-social and justice-based orientations and actions. And so I think like the place that research needs to go is identifying like where are communities doing this well, how can others learn from these groups. So there's a lot more that we can learn about this. But on that note, I will turn it over for questions, and I'm happy to talk more about these different projects. Oh, my light went out again.
Thank you so much for that, Jamie. I know the pain as well of the environmental friendly office lights. It's a wonderful thing, but also a challenging thing. I'm sure we'll have questions coming in on the Q&A, which is where I'd encourage folks to post them. One thing that I guess I was wondering that you mentioned early on was that there was this emphasis among the people that you talked to and when you were doing the interviews for the Mindful Elite about sort of like the neuroscience or the science. How do you have a sense of like how engaged they are with the science or how aware they are of sort of what it says? Because I guess at least my sense or my experience is that the kind of the talking points that people give you when they talk about how amazing these things are for your brain or how much they change it, that they're really out of date. You know, that people are talking about the neuroprotective effects or the neurogenerative effects, or they're talking about neurogenesis, or they're talking about things sort of that are small studies that weren't necessarily well done, and you know they may not have replicated, and they're probably now 20, 30 years old, but they're still the commonly parroted talking points. I guess, do you have a sense of that? Like, were they familiar with the science? Were they aware of it, or did it seem like they were just kind of parroting back the talking points?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So they were very loose with the science. And I think you also have to keep in mind that a lot of the people who are bringing contemplative practice into business, into the military, into sports, like these people are not trained academics. And so they don't really understand or read the primary sources. But they realize just in speaking, you know, and trying to pitch their programs that if they mention science and they mention effects that companies are interested in, like better attention practices, resilience, better mental health, better ability to focus and control your emotions, that companies will be interested in those things, especially for their most important knowledge workers whose brains are very valuable to them. So it becomes more of like a marketing speak than actual science. So one of the things that has been really interesting for me in tracing where these practices are going and how people are talking about them is it seems kind of like a game of telephone where it starts off with, you know, one paper or one idea, and then it kind of changes as it moves. And there's new research coming out. So Carolyn Chen's book, but there's also this wonderful team of researchers in France, Ghazi Islam and Marie Holm, and they study bringing mindfulness into a French bank. And both of those studies point to how, at the end of the day, the people hiring these mindful coaches, they don't really care, I think, about the actual science. They just, the veneer of it and the languaging provides enough legitimacy that in a secular and a rational and a profit-seeking organization, it aligns with the logics of what they're doing. And so it's enough to get the mindfulness in the door.
Thank you for that. That's kind of what I suspected. We have a question. I suspect, I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect this pertains to the survey data that you talked about at the latter part of your talk. And the question sort of just is more around, can you say a bit about how the sample was comprised? I mean, was it a nationally representative sample, or were there particular biases? I mean, I guess I was also wondering to myself whether you're aware of, and this, you might not have had the data, but whether or not the kind of ways in which the spiritual versus the religious people were engaged. You know, wasn't that the religious people tended to be more engaged in sort of more conservative political activity, and the spiritual more progressive, or about, you know, or something along those lines?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So to give you a little bit more information on the study, and it's publicly available at the ARDA website. So if anyone's interested in using the data, I would recommend it, because as far as I know, Brian Steensland and his team at Indiana University, Purdue University in Indianapolis, they've used it, we've used it, and I don't know of anyone else who has. So I encourage others to use it. So the data was collected by NORC on behalf of the Fetzer Institute and Hathaway Communications, and the sample is of US adults 18 or older. So it is a national survey. There was 3,609 interviews, including 3,256 by web mode and 253 by phone. And the interview completion rate was 28%. So that's a little bit of background on that. And that's also, there's more information available at the ARDA website where you can download it. In terms of, so this is a question, so I'm starting to talk to reporters now about this paper, and that's what they want to know is like, well, is this a good thing or a bad thing, and like what kind of political behavior are they engaged in? And in the United States right now, if you talk about religion and politics, the news cycle is dominated by the rise of Christian nationalism and the rightward lurch in evangelical churches. So I mean, I think that those people are probably in this study as well. We did find that the religious and spiritual people were the most politically engaged. So that's another part of the story I didn't talk as much about. But I think that our finding in speaking about the spiritual but not religious practitioners, or the spiritual practitioners writ large, is just bringing attention to a group of people that a lot of people have beliefs about who they are and what they do. And it, I think, undermines this story of selfish spirituality. So like within that group, the other thing I think that's important to say is that when we looked, and I can actually show you some of this data. So let me pop to this. So when we looked at who was doing spiritual practice as opposed to religious practice, we could see that Republicans were more likely to say they did religious practice. And we could see that gay, lesbian, bisexual people were more likely to say that they did spiritual practice. We also found that atheists and agnostics, as you'd expect, were less likely to do religious practice. People who were divorced were more likely to say they were doing spiritual practice, and women were more likely to do spiritual practice. So there is our data did point to the fact that some of these people are likely disaffected by the rightward turn in the white Christian nationalism in the United States and are more likely to be progressive. But we don't have data on the specific organizations that they were engaged in, but that is definitely a great direction for new research to move in.
Thanks for that. And arguably, I guess, particularly in the US, where voting or engagement with politics is not mandatory as it is here in Australia, any
Oh,
engagement with democracy is a good thing. Yeah, here in Australia, voting is mandatory, which is kind of a cool and interesting thing that I learned when I moved here.
wow, that actually sounds amazing. And that's kind of the underlying story of, like, in America, we want people to vote. We want all people to vote, but they do not.
Yeah, and it can be quite challenging to get people to do so.
And there's, increasingly lots of things that make it harder for some people to vote.
Exactly.
So.
Hannah has a question. Hannah wants to know whether or not the various events that have happened, in the U.S. recently, Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the Capitol riots on January 6th, whether or not there's been any observable impact of those things on the kind of elite, mindful, or other contemplative community, and what your thoughts are on sort of whether there's a challenge, whether that's a challenge to the project, sorry, whether there's a challenge to the project of the military and police mindfulness, perhaps from the Buddhist perspective. So, what's the pushback, or has there been any change as a result of these various major socio-political events?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So that is where the mindful lead I ended, and basically it was like I ended with, some of these programs are just starting. Who knows how it's going to go from here? And in the last, I guess, 6 or 7 years since I stopped collecting data, there have been a lot more events and programs run through the Mind and Life Institute, run through the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, in terms of like the mindfulness sphere, where they're doing like race conscious or anti-racist programs. Also for the yoga folks, the Off the Mat Yoga organization did a Get Out the Vote campaign. They did like a racial yoga practice retreat during election season, during our last presidential election. And they were connecting with activists and like trying to bring yoga practitioners more into doing these things. So there's definitely some exciting things that are happening. As a sociologist, I do have a cautionary kind of note where I did sit in on some of these meetings, and I thought about studying it, but then it was really complicated. I think it's a good thing that these organizations are doing these civically engaged and more race conscious programs. Some of the race conscious programs aren't being necessarily facilitated by experts and racial theory. And so some of it's very experimental and there's room for progress. But I also think that, like, given where the United States is at now, it's better to engage, even if it's not perfect, than not. So we just have to all learn how to work together more.
Larissa wants to know whether you think it's feasible that organizations could respond to evidence generated from social science research in a similar way to how sort of neuroscience is received. She says, I'm guessing that as high quality social studies of external social effects of contemplative practices emerge, it may help change the public narrative. So I guess she's wondering, can social sciences and well-done studies like the ones you're talking about, can they have a similar impact to kind of what we've seen neuroscience do?
So that's a really good question. It makes me think, Ezra Klein recently did an interview with someone talking about how the media environment is shaping the world we live in the political sphere, in the public sphere right now, in really profound ways. And as a sociologist, I think that there are some inherent challenges to getting our work out there that neuroscientists seem to be able to get around. And so I guess what I'm thinking of is just like the story I'm presenting today is a complex story, right? It's not a soundbite. I don't think you can understand it in one phrase or one sentence. I think you need to see the layers and see how they add up and combine, and then see the context and then understand that it's not what you thought. So it's a really different way of doing science and embedding and trying to understand different realities, and also understand your own lives in new ways from broader perspectives, taking into account power and organizational structures and cultures and all these things. So it is hard sometimes to get our story out there in the format that journalists want. And so the mindful elite, I tried, and I ended up fighting with some journalists as they tried to morph the story into kind of the anti-mindfulness, like, super, neoliberal capitalist critiques. And I couldn't do it. And I just said, no, I'd rather not tell the story under my name than oversimplify it. The new paper with Evan is gaining more traction, maybe because it's like there's a hook, it's a quantitative finding, it's more simplistic. So the media environment definitely favors those kinds of findings. And I think neuroscience, like you can kind of translate a finding into, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, you would know more about this than me. But yeah, so I do think that we need, to take time to, learn deep sociological stories, and there's some challenges inherent to that, but that's not to say that we shouldn't keep trying. And I think that these stories are really important. So thank you for all of you who are here tonight. I appreciate it.
I wanted to, in the US in particular, think about like the Society for Neuroscience. I mean, their annual conference has 30,000 attendees. And their offices in Washington, D.C. are just down from the Capitol, and they're a pretty significant lobbying body. Whereas if you compare that, say, to the American Sociological Association or, the American psychiatric or psychological associations or societies, they're a lot smaller. So I suspect that probably plays a role as well, right? Where, and as you said, I think, yeah, it's simple results are easier for journalists to get the, to get the story out and to sell than nuance. That's been my experience too, is journalists and people in the general public struggle with nuance.
Yeah, and the models are hard to get past. And we're also in a climate where science is increasingly politicized, so that also can make it challenging.
Tim has a question, and I guess he's wondering whether you could clarify something at the end of the mindful elite. So he says, the question he's particularly curious about that you posed towards the end is, what is lost when religious cultures embedded in other societies' values, practices, and norms are systematically adapted to appeal to new audiences in quite different contexts, which contain elements antithetical to the originating cultures? And so he kind of raises the point that one thing that seems to be lost is the relieving of other people's suffering. And so I guess he's just wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on that point.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There is definitely a deep and complicated answer to that question, but I'll do my best on the fly. So first of all, thank you, Tim, for reading my book so closely. I really appreciate it. And I wish we could do this in person so I could actually see you and shake your hand and talk to you in person after the event, but feel free to email me if you want to continue the conversation as well. But so as a sociologist, I think one of the things that's often lost is the community behind religious practice. The fact that when people, so when Tibetans, for example, were meditating in Tibet in religious communities, there was a structure to that. They did it in a group together, and there were norms and there were ethical precepts that they were supposed to adhere to. And so as mindfulness is being moved into other secular places like workplaces, one, that kind of community around shared values and practices is no longer necessarily there, and people, especially in an individualistic culture like the United States, don't even recognize that, like that could be really important and valuable to what they're doing. So the ethical precepts is another thing that, as you can see in some of the case studies I showed you, so thou shalt not kill, that kind of ethical orientation is questioned when you talk about bringing mindfulness to the military. The idea with business of like, oh, mindfulness is being harnessed to help workers be more productive. Well, it's like, well, what happened to the emancipatory potential? And also, the understanding of Buddhists under Buddhist religious system that they were seeking enlightenment and getting off the wheel of samsara and the cycle. So all of that is also missing. And so when you take away the cosmological context, you take away the ethical precepts, you take away, the implicit communities that these practices have been used in, suddenly you're actually talking about something really, really different. It's not Buddhist meditation. It's a new form of like therapeutic mind training. And I think that that's the fact that often these things are kind of collapsed under one umbrella, I think is something that is really, really problematic.
Thank you for that. Another question that I think starts that kind of picks up on one of the points that you raised there. And I'm not, so there's a question that were there enough Buddhists in the sample that it was possible to explore differences in experience from Buddhists and non-Buddhists? And I'm not sure what, I'm guessing this refers potentially to the latter study. But whether or not, I guess, you know that, the second part I think could probably be answered regardless, which is the point of, I'm curious if the mindfulness training has different effects in the presence versus absence of the ethical components for Buddhism, sorry.
Sorry, can you ask that one more time? I think I missed the beginning.
So the beginning part was, was the sample of Buddhists large enough to look at whether there were differences among sort of Buddhists versus non-Buddhists? And then the second part is does mindfulness training sort of, are you aware of anything or have you done anything yourself that would sort of see whether or not mindfulness meditation training looks different or has different effects in the presence versus absence, or of the ethical components of Buddhism? So looking at it kind of in the Buddhist context versus the non-Buddhist context.
Mm-hmm. So that's a really good question. So I can't get at that with the samples that I have. The quantitative study based on spiritual practices had a really rough measure of religious groups, which was one of the weaknesses of the data set. So it wasn't very good identifying Christians, which would have enabled us to test some of your other questions, Dick. But then for like Buddhists would fall under another category. So we couldn't get at that. And I think as a qualitative researcher, with respect to the mindful elite, I think it's important to recognize there's different generations as well at play here in the mindfulness movement. So a lot of the first generation folks, the folks who are really passionate about Buddhism and about meditation, oftentimes outside of work, and say they were bringing mindfulness practice into work on their own time, a lot of them were going to Buddhist retreats. So like these things were moving back and forth. People were doing both sometimes. So it's a murky boundary. So that's one of the other challenges to quantitatively studying spirituality, is that a lot of people in practice do a bunch of things. So for example, sitting at a cafe with Adam Engel in Boulder, Colorado, he was like, I just listened to some Hindu chanting on the way over, and I do yoga, and I've like spent a lot of time with Buddhists at this point, and I meditate, but like, what would you call me? So it's hard to kind of like, I think that assumption too, I mean, there's definitely some people who are Buddhist practitioners, but I think you'd have to set up a study specifically testing those questions. As for the ethical precepts, there's, like I said, Carolyn Chen's book would probably be of interest to you because she gets at what happens when they're missing and when Buddhism's essentially co-opted to support the corporate bottom line. It's not just Buddhism, it's spiritual practices writ large. So she has this great example in her book of this labyrinth at this one company, and you know how you walk in the labyrinth and usually like you come to the middle and it's supposed to be this space of introspection and profound insight. And instead you get to the middle of this labyrinth and there's the company logo. So that just like kind of feels blasphemous. But so this is happening in Silicon Valley, right? So that is a case in study where like you don't have some of these like anti-greed, anti-attachment precepts, and you can see that I mean, so then I think the next step would be to be focusing on the people who are meditating in these companies and on their mental health and on how long they last in their companies. And so you could do a number of ways to study it. So yeah, I don't have the answer in my research, but I hope somebody takes up those questions. They're very important questions.
And since I've got you, I know your initial book raised a lot of questions from me as to sort of where the mindful movement started and what the intentions were, and I guess what Jon Kabat-Zinn and others sort of where they were coming from and what they really were trying to do. I guess I'm wondering if in one word you could say, in terms of moving forward, are you optimistic? Are you pessimistic? Or are you somewhere in between as to what's in store?
That's a good question. I think my answer is that we're all human and we don't have infinite knowledge. So we're never going to do perfect action. But I think that, studies like mine, I hope, will be used to broaden the perspective so people can then reflect on what they're doing and what their purposes are and how they're using the practices to then better align with their own personal meaning systems and purposes. And I hope that, it encourages people to connect back. And I think a lot of meditators do this, but to connect back to like, what is your personal meaning system? And in relation to how much we all work, so academics included, right? It's like, is this healthy? Is this good for us? Do we need to, or do we really need to be reorienting ourselves? So yeah, I think that it can be used as a tool, and I hope that it's a tool that's used like in process to help people.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie, for your evening time and for your presentation, and thank you to the audience for joining us. Please subscribe to our newsletter to keep updated about this. So we'll put this on YouTube when we have it edited, and other upcoming events hosted by the Contemplative Studies Center. Jamie, I hope we can all talk to you more, and look forward to seeing more of your work. And we look forward to seeing the rest of you in the audience again soon. So thank you all.
Absolutely. Thank you all for the hearts and the emojis, and I appreciate it. It was wonderful to connect, and yes, I hope we connect again in the future. Thanks again for inviting me.
Thank you, Jamie.
Bye.